Rabbi, good morning or good afternoon. My name is Rabbi James Kennard. I made Aliyah nearly a year ago. I've been speaking here a few times before. Basically, when Rabbi Shaw needs me, I'm coming. Good question. From Australia and not Brooklyn. You can tell you've narrowed it down to not Brooklyn. Excellent. I am born and bred in the United Kingdom, subject of His Majesty. In the United Kingdom, but I did spend many years in Australia before coming here. Yeah, more or less.
Okay. In other words, he doesn't have an American accent.
No, we will establish that. Okay. So Rabbi Shaw's asked me to teach this spot this week and next week. Next week we'll be looking at a piece of the Megillah. This week I wanted to look at a more global view of what Purim represents. And let me start by asking, as we all know, what is not in the Megillah? The name of Hashem. Does this make it the only book in the Tanakh with that? No, it's not actually. But it's certainly significant that when we are praising Hashem for the salvation, when we're saying Ala Nissim and we're thanking Hashem, yet Hashem's name is not in the Megillah. It is alluded to. Next week we'll see one of the key places it's alluded to, but it's not there in the Megillah. What could be the significance of this? Why is it not in the Megillah, and what does that teach us? So we'll come back to that question. Next question I want to ask is, what is the meaning of a particular Gemara, which is quite well known? The story it tells is quite well known, but what is the meaning, and how does the story make sense? So let's start on the sheet with quote number 1, which comes from the Chumash. At the moment of Matan Torah, or just before the Torah was given, we read, Vayotze Moshe et ha'am, Moshe brought out the people, likrat Elokim, towards God, min ha'machaneh, from the camp, V'yityatzvu, and they stood, betachtit hahar. Betachtit hahar. What does tachtit hahar mean? So here's an interesting example for those who are interested in the tension between pshat and drash, between the simple meaning of the text and the more homiletic meaning of the text. Here we have one of those examples where the balance is reversed. The literal meaning of the text is the one adopted by the Midrash. The non-literal meaning of the text, we would say they stood in the foothills or at the foot of Har Sinai. That's how we translate it to make it make sense according to the simple level, according to the pshat. But if we look at the literal meaning of the word, in this case, tachtit means underneath. But tachtit hahar, underneath the mountain. And the Midrash, as we will see, works with the literal meaning of the word tachtit, as opposed to the simple reading of the text, which actually has the non-literal meaning. I won't get stuck into that because it's another topic, but it's just interesting that sometimes the most literal meaning is not the same as the simplest one. I heard Nechama Leibovitz herself tell me there's a difference between pshat, simple meaning of the text, and mashma'ut, literal meaning of the text. So after that, let's see what the Midrash is. So the Gemara says in number 2, on the words Vayityatzvu betachtit hahar, and it understands, for the purpose of this Midrash, tachtit means literally underneath. They stood underneath the mountain. What's going on? Continues the Gemara. Amar Rav Avdime bar Chama bar Chasa Melamed. So Rav, the various people say, this teaches Shakafa HaKadosh Baruch Hu Aleihem et Hahar Kagigit, that Hashem suspended over their heads the mountain Kagigit. You can translate that as a barrel. I prefer like a bucket. Sounds a bit more sort of authentic. He held the mountain over their heads. So they were literally betachtit hahar. They were under the mountain. The word tachtit implies the mountain was over their heads. Hashem lifted up the mountain over their heads. Va'amar lahem. And he said to them, Im atem mekablim haTorah mutav. If you accept the Torah, jolly good. Ve'im lav sham tehei kevuratchem. And if not, there will be your graves. So we read the story of the Torah, of Matan Torah. We tell our children about the mountain covered with flowers. Actually, it was in flames. We don't tell them that bit. We tell them about the people said Naaseh v'nishma, which was a fantastic expression of their willingness to accept the Torah. According to the Gemara here in Shabbos, it's not like that. They were told, accept the Torah or else. And then in number 3, the response of the Gemara is obvious. Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov, Mikan moda'a Rabba la'araita. Rav Acha bar Yaakov says from here there is a big objection to the Torah. Because the Jewish people can say forevermore, we were forced into accepting it. It wasn't a voluntary acceptance. That covenant stuff, that Brit stuff, it was all one-sided because we had a mountain over our heads. Moda'a Rabba la'araita is a big objection to the Torah. However, don't worry. Amar Rava, afal pikein hadur kabluha bimei Achashverosh. Rava says they came back and they accepted it in the time of Achashverosh. As it's dichtiv, as it says in the Megillah, kimu v'kiblu. Kimu they maintained or they established, v'kiblu and they accepted. HaYehudim, the Jews, accepted and established. Says the Gemara on that, Kaimu ma shekiblu kavar. They established what they had accepted previously. So, story, mountain over their heads, Moda'a Rabba la'araita, a big objection to the Torah, because it means it was a forced acceptance, which is not an acceptance. But it's okay, because there was another moment in Jewish history when they accepted the Torah willingly. And we can see that alluded to in the words of the Megillah, Kimu v'kiblu, they established what they had previously accepted. So we have a few questions. Number one, what on earth is this mountain over their heads? That's not our image of HaKadosh Baruch Hu giving the Torah. Number two, of all the times to rectify this huge problem, Purim, I mean, we're getting in the mood for Purim, and we like Purim, and it's fun, but we also know that there are other more significant times in Jewish history. Yetziat Mitzrayim, Binyan Beit HaMikdash, Purim, which is an interesting story in itself, but it's sort of self-contained. How can Purim be the key that unlocks the acceptance of the Torah? And there's another point. There is roughly 800 years between Matan Torah and Purim. So for all those 800 years, the Torah was not accepted, apparently. Because this problem of not accepting the Torah voluntarily, or not even being given a chance to accept it voluntarily, was not rectified until Purim. So during the whole of Bayit Rishon, during the whole period of the kingdom, they didn't accept the Torah, they hadn't accepted the Torah willingly. How can we explain this? So the answer is there are many ways of explaining this, and there are many things learned from this story. I'm going to give you one, which I hope will be of interest. I put on the page numbers 4 and 5. It's not strictly our topic, but I'll just mention it outside. The Ramban explains the story like this. It says, the Ramban in number 4, and again in number 5, I'll say it outside, says that the Jews did have this Moda'a Rabba, exactly as we said up till now. They were forced to accept the Torah, but they went along with it because they went into Eretz Israel. It should have been immediately. It was 40 years after accepting the Torah. And the Torah makes very clear that the Torah is to be fulfilled in Eretz Israel. And the brachot and the shmirah, the guardianship that HaKadosh Baruch Hu promises at Har Sinai is fulfilled in Eretz Israel. The Ramban was a big, big Zionist. And the Ramban says the Jews accepted the non-acceptance of the Torah without complaining because they went into Eretz Israel and enjoyed all the brachos of being in Eretz Israel. Then the time came when the Jews sinned. They were exiled from Eretz Israel. And they had the option then of saying, you know what? We never accepted the Torah. We only did it to get Eretz Israel. And now we haven't got Eretz Israel. And there's a pasuk in Yechezkel, which is quoted here, as the Navi says to people, don't say you're like a slave whose master has sold you to someone else. Don't say that you can now go and do your own thing. Because there was a real fear that after losing Eretz Israel, which was, if you like, the payback for being forced to accept the Torah, the Jews would now go off and worship other gods. But they didn't. They went back to Eretz Israel. Unfortunately, only a small percentage did, but that percentage went back to Eretz Israel and willingly accepted, if you like, the deal thereafter. The deal is we'll live in Eretz Israel and Hashem will look after us, and that's the covenant. So it's as if they accepted the Torah. And the time of going back to Eretz Israel, the end of the first exile, the beginning of Bayit Sheni, is the same time as Purim. Part of the backdrop to Purim, which we won't get into now, was the Torah, the temple was in ruins. It was time for the Jews to be allowed to go back to Eretz Israel and rebuild the Bet Mikdash, and Achashverosh didn't let them. Achashverosh wouldn't let that happen. It wait till his descendant, probably his grandson Koresh, to let them do that. But the moment of Purim is more or less simultaneous with the moment of going back to Eretz Yisrael for Bayit Sheni. So says the Ramban, that's what the Gemara means when it says they re-accepted the Torah in the time of Achashverosh. After they were saved from Achashverosh, just like they were saved from Paro, and the Ramban says it was even more dear to them that they were saved from Achashverosh, then they went back to Eretz Yisrael voluntarily and voluntarily accepted the Torah. So his focus, just one moment, his focus is not on Purim, his focus is on, as it often is for the Ramban, the relationship between the Jews and Eretz Yisrael. Yes?
Most of the people did not go back.
That's true. I realized that as I was saying it. That would be a question for the Ramban. For those who did go back, they did. By the way, I'll just mention, we're all living here in Israel. I think most of us in this room are Olim, and rightly proud of it. In the time of Bayit Sheni, I think it's reckoned between 10 and 15% of the Jews went back to Israel. And in our times, we've way exceeded that. Way exceeded that. And that's something that we can be proud of in our times, that we've done more than those who came back with Ezra and Nehemiah. Okay.
On the first about the putting of the mountain over, I heard a more softened approach. That it wasn't that Hashem was threatening them, that he was saying it was like a chobah, and he was saying if you accept the Torah, it will be so good for you, and if not that you'll be buried, but that you will not have a life. You will be as if you were buried because of the beauty of the Torah.
Okay.
I heard that once. I don't know who said it, but it sounded good.
The Midrash itself we can describe as a homily, and you're putting a homily on the homily, which I suppose is fair enough. And I'm going to give my own interpretation, which is also one of many. I do like the idea, though, it's like a chuppah. And I can imagine the chosin saying to the kala, if you accept my proposal, that'll be great. If not, bah.
You're going to have a crappy life. That will be a great situation.
Hashem was accepting on himself the obligation, that somebody who gets engaged, they have an erus and he cannot send away the kala forever.
And that was the chuppah.
That was the chuppah.
Okay, it's still it's a chuppah with a dark side. Okay, let's move on. We've got a few questions unanswered. Let's have another one. Number 6. The Rambam at the end of Hilchos Megillah, the Rambam ends each of his halachic sections with something a little bit sort of uplifting, if I may say. And he says the following, which is based on Yerushalmi. Others read the Yerushalmi differently, but he says as follows: Kol sifrei hanavim, v'kol hakatuvim atidim libatel limot hamashiach. All the books of the Nevi'im and all the books of the Ketuvim are going to be cancelled in the days of Mashiach. Chutz Megillat Esther. Megillat Esther. V'harei hi kayamet chamisha chumshei Torah ukahilchot shel Torah shebal peh. Megillah will exist, will continue, just like the 5 books of the Torah and like the halachot of the Torah. In other words, the Torah shebal peh, as he says, Torah shebal peh. She'einon betelim la'olam, which will never end forever. And he doesn't give the reference, but I've given the reference to the Yerushalmi there. So in Yemot HaMashiach, the bookshelf will look a little bit different. You'll go to the Tanakh section, and you'll find 5 books of the Torah and Megillat Esther, and that's it. Now, again, this is surprising. This raises a question. What is the Rambam, based on the Yerushalmi, saying? And again, if you were asked to name book number 6, if I said we're only allowed 6 books out of the 24 books of Tanakh, and obviously the first 5 are the Chumash, what would your 6th candidate be? I suspect for most of us it wouldn't be Megillat Esther. Well, you're sure? By the way, in the next source, which I forgot to number, so 6b, is the Bavli, the Gemara, that says it's going to be the 5 books of Moses and Yeshua, because Yeshua describes the value of the land of Eretz Yisrael. But we're not going that way. We're going with the Rambam's way. What is it about the Megillah that makes the Megillah stand? By the way, he gives us a big clue for the interpretation I'm going to share. He gives us a big clue. He says that the Megillah will remain like the 5 books of Torah and like the halachot of the Torah shebal peh. Now, what do the 5 books of Torah have? They have lots and lots of mitzvot. The Torah shebal peh is the details of the mitzvot. What about the other books of the Tanakh?
They don't.
The other books of the Tanakh, with one exception, do not have mitzvot. And as I will explain, there's a very important reason why not. But there's one book of Tanakh, and only one book of Tanakh, that has mitzvot. What are they? If we look in number 7, at the end of the story, everything's hunky-dory, and Mordechai wants to remind the Jews to celebrate and commemorate their salvation. Mordechai wrote these words, Vayishlach Sefarim el kol hayudim, and he sent books or scribes to all the Jews, letters, all scribes, Asher b'chol medinot hamelach, who were in all the provinces of the king, Achashverosh, Hakrovim v'Harochokim, near and far. And what did the letters say? L'kayem aleihem, that the people should accept upon themselves, L'hiyot osim et yom arba asar l'chodesh Adar, but they should make the 14th of Adar, ve'ed yom chamisha asar bo, and the 15th for those living in walled cities. Didn't mention what's going to happen this year. That's another story, because it's 3 days of Purim. Anyway, on the 15th, Gam B'kol Shana V'Shana. So the Jews should accept them on themselves that every year, on the 14th and the 15th, they should do things. What should they do? Next pasuk, turn over the page. Kayomim asher nachu behem haYehudim me'oyevehem. Like the days on which the Jews rested from their enemies. That's the 14th of Adar and the 15th for Shushan. And the whole month which was turned from sadness to joy, and from mourning to festival, to make them days of feasting and joy, and sending mishloach manot to each other, and gifts to the poor. And elsewhere it talks about something which is understood as reading the Megillah. So there you have the 4 mitzvot of Purim, which Mordechai says the Jews have got to keep. So, if we want to have on our bookshelf the laws of the Torah, we will need in the future the 5 books of Moshe, the Chomshei Torah, and the Torah Sheba'al Peh, and Megillat Esther, because without Megillat Esther, we're missing these mitzvot. Yes? Well, no, and I'll tell you why, as I will explain. Baal Tosif is the prohibition of adding extra to a mitzvah, or adding an extra mitzvah, Machloket Rashi and Ramban.
So do we only have 609 mitzvahs?
No, we have 613 and another 4. But actually we have more than 4, but we will explain. Okay? So, why, by the way, won't we need the other books of Tanakh? The simple answer to that is, there's a theme to the other books of Tanakh. The theme is, you're rubbish people, improve, if I can sum it up. The Nevi'im come and tell us that things are not so good and things need to get better. And that is the theme repeated over and over again in lots of different ways throughout the books of Tanakh. There's narrative there, there's history there, of course, but the main message is, as I've just perhaps caricatured or summed up. B'yamot HaMashiach, we won't need that message. B'yamot HaMashiach, we won't be told to improve ourselves, because we will be living on such a high level that we will have reached the top already. So we won't need the other books of Tanakh, except for Megillat Esther, because we'll need the book of the mitzvot. Now, is this a good idea for Mordechai to be inserting these mitzvot? Let's have a look. So the question was asked, is it Baal Tosif? So, sorry, let me just make clear. Rashi says Baal Tosif is like taking a mitzvah and making more of it, to say that you have to have 5 strings, 5 corners in your tzitzis, or you have to have 5 parts in, sorry, not tzitzis, 5 parts in the tefillin, instead of the 4 chapters that we have. Or to have an extra one in the Arba Minim, which would make it Chameshet Minim. The Ramban learns it would be like a whole extra mitzvah, something that I can't sort of add to, but not adding to an existing mitzvah, but a whole extra mitzvah. Either way, they're forbidden. It is forbidden to add a whole extra mitzvah, or even to add an extra bit to a mitzvah. You might be thinking, but don't we do this quite often? Don't we have lots of additions to the mitzvot? So that's if you're thinking that, you're on the right lines. The Rambam, and I've quoted this just because the Rambam, as is his style, puts in a succinct and clear way the halacha that we're talking about, but we find it in the Gemara, we find it in the Chumash. And it's like this in number 8. Im ya'amod ish bein min ha'umat bein mi Yisrael. If a person arises, either Jewish or not Jewish, v'ya'aseh ot umofet, and he does a sign or a wonder, va'omar, and he says, shahashem shalcho lahosif mitzvah, or ligra mitzvah, and Hashem has sent me to add a mitzvah or to subtract a mitzvah. Harei zeh navi sheker. This is a false navi, a lying navi. Shaharei ba lahachish nevuato shel Moshe. He's come to deny the nevuah of Moshe. By the way, some people say that the Rambam's being a bit polemist here. I wouldn't say that. I would never say that. The Rambam is teaching Torah. He's not fulfilling an external agenda. But it's worth pointing out that this halacha that says if you come to add a mitzvah or subtract a mitzvah, you're a navi sheker. And I didn't put it on the page, but you're executed. That's the punishment for a navi sheker. The Rambam might have been included in this Christianity and Islam, both of which are premised on God did have a covenant, 613 mitzvah, but they've changed. God changed his mind. He took away most of them. He took away all of them. That person has denied the nevuah of Moshe. One of the Ikrei Amunah, one of the principles of faith, enunciated by the Rambam again, is that the nevuah of Moshe is greater than all other nevuah from other Jews and even from non-Jews. And the nevuah of Moshe, by definition, cannot be contested. So, somebody who adds an extra mitzvah is a navi sheker, is put to death, has done a very, very bad thing. Any problems here? Anyone now in the firing line? Mordechai. We have just declared Mordechai to be a navi sheker, which is obviously problematic. Okay, you're ahead of me. Okay, so we just saw a suggestion that Mordechai is not a navi. Well, in truth, that's not quite the full picture. If we jump to number 11, no, sorry, I'll go out of order. I'll go to number 9. So the Gemara again in Megillah says, Tanu Rabbanim, Arba'im u'shmonim neviim. There were 48 neviim, v'sheva neviot, and 7 prophetesses. There are actually many more, but those 48 and 7 we actually know about, and they're named in the Tanakh. Nitnavu. Sorry? Okay, thank you. Nitnavu lahem liYisrael. They prophesied to Israel. V'lo pichatu v'lo hatiru al ma shekatuv b'Torah, and they didn't subtract and they didn't add to what's written in the Torah. Chutz mimikra Megillah, except for Megillah, Mikra Megillah. So before we read the next line, let's just pause for a minute and start threading some of these pieces together. A navi cannot introduce a new halacha. Hashem said, here's the package, 613 mitzvot, no more than that. If a navi, or no fewer than that either. If a navi, now what is a navi? A navi is somebody with a hotline to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. A navi is someone who receives messages from HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the way the rest of us don't. Now, if a navi wanted to add a mitzvah of his own, to say, I've got a good idea, I think you should do something, and he says, and he appears in this town square where Nevi'im did, what would people say? People would say, he's telling us to do this because HaKadosh Baruch Hu has told him. Because that's what a navi is. A navi is a conduit for messages from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So if a navi says, I've got a good idea, I think we should keep a mitzvah, he can't do that. He can't do that because then he runs the risk of being seen as adding to the Torah itself on behalf of Hashem. And Hashem says you can't add to the Torah and you will never add to the Torah. So a navi cannot institute a new halacha. There are a few counterexamples, which I will deal with briefly in a moment. But basically, a navi cannot institute a new halacha. And yet, we've just read that 48 Nevi'im and 7 Nevi'ot prophesied for Israel, and they didn't introduce any new halacha, except the one that they did. Why did they institute Mikra Megillah? On what basis? Why is that not subject to the same restriction as every other mitzvah that they can't introduce? And the Gemara sort of raises its own question. They didn't introduce any mitzvah except the one that they did. And the next paragraph sort of answers it, but by raising other questions. My Darush, what did they seek? What did they seek to find a source for the idea that we should read the Megillah? Amar Rabbi Chia bar Avim, Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Karchia. Ma me'avdot lecherut amrinan shira. What is the case when we are delivered from slavery to freedom? We say shira, we sing Hallel, as we did when we came out of Mitzrayim. So mimita lachayim lo kol shekain. From death to life, how much more so? How much more so should we celebrate and sing a song of celebration when we are saved from death to life, as we were in the time of Achashverosh. We don't say Hallel, but we read the Megillah instead.
Because it didn't happen
Okay.
in Israel.
Yeah, that's right. So the great question, which is used in the context of Hallel on Yom Ha'atzmaut, is why is there no Hallel on Purim? And one of the answers is the Megillah is the equivalent to Hallel. Yeah, there are other answers which go in a different direction. Okay, we're very close. We're very close. You can see where we're going with this. We're very close to unraveling that. Yes?
The way it says it here is Vayiktav Mordechai Asad Varam Ha'ela. He didn't say that this is from Hashem.
Okay.
He said, this is what I think should be done because we were saved.
Okay, so
He didn't say he was.
all this is telling me either I'm a very good teacher or I'm not teaching you anything new. One or the other, because you're ahead of me in where we're going with this. My Dorish is a fascinating question. Not the question itself, but why we need that question. If a Navi is going to introduce a new mitzvah, which they can't, but if they're going to, how will they do that? Hashem will give them a message, and I'll say, here's a new mitzvah. But that's not what these Nevi'im who instituted Mikra Megillah did. They looked for a source. They looked for a reason to introduce it, and they worked it out from pre-existing material. They said, look, we already have a mitzvah to say Hallel on Pesach. We can derive from that. We can darshan from that we will work out we have a mitzvah to read the Megillah on Purim. The Nevi'im who instituted Mikra Megillah were not acting like Nevi'im. They were acting like Rabbanim or Chachamim or the Sanhedrin, who work in an entirely different way. I said, you might wonder, don't we have lots of mitzvot that were added by the rabbis? Yes, we have a myriad of mitzvot that were added by the rabbis. In some cases, in most cases, they added to an existing mitzvah. Shabbat. If we only kept mitzvah d'oraita for Shabbat, it would look very, very different to the way we keep Shabbat. Because I'm sure that I haven't done a survey, but the vast majority of halachot, of what you can and can't do on Shabbat, come from the rabbis to safeguard the integrity of the original mitzvah from the Torah. As we said at the beginning of Pirkei Avot, Chazal were enjoined to make a fence around the Torah, a sayag the Torah. It's part of Chazal's job to add extra restrictions, usually restrictions, to safeguard the existence of the original mitzvah. And more than that, they added extra mitzvot. The mitzvah of Kriyat Megillah, the mitzvah of Chanukah, which we'll come to in a minute, and a few other mitzvot. If you look at the back of the Sefer HaChinuch, they're listed there, the mitzvah added by the rabbis. So we've just said that a Navi can't add a mitzvah on pain of death, but a rabbi can, because a rabbi is not claiming that this mitzvah comes from God. The rabbi is very explicit, this mitzvah comes from the rabbis, and indeed, when one learns a new halachic topic, the first question to ask in any halachic topic is always, is this mitzvah midoraita or is it midorabanan? Because the rules are different. So the first thing to know about any halachic topic is which bit comes from the rabbis and which bit comes from the Torah. If a Navi introduced a new mitzvah, it would look like it came from the Torah, even when it didn't. But when a rabbi introduces a new mitzvah, it's explicit that it comes from the rabbis. So that's why this almost self-contradictory line of the Gemara, number 9 on the page, says they didn't introduce any new mitzvah, except the one they did. And then the next paragraph explains they darshaned, they analyze what the previous material tells us, and on that basis, we work out what to do next. That's what rabbis do. Nevi'im don't do that. They don't engage in sort of pilpul. They don't work it out. They just get the message. Chazal work it out. And who is Mordechai? Is Mordechai a Navi or is he a rabbi? Well, the answer actually, if we look a bit further, if we look at Rashi number 11, on the Gemara that we just learned, Rashi says they didn't introduce any mitzvah, chutz mimikra Megillah. Ve'im tomar ner Chanukah. If you say, what about ner Chanukah? I mean, Chanukah and Purim often go together. Ner Chanukah and Kriyat Megillah sort of often go together. They're both added later. So why don't we mention that when we said 48 Nevi'im, 7 Nevi'ot instituted only one mitzvah, what about Chanukah? Didn't they introduce that as well? Says Rashi, Kavar Pasku HaNevi'im. The Nevi'im had finished by the time it come to Chanukah. So Chanukah is absolutely pure rabbinic. Chanukah doesn't need to be mentioned here because there were no Nevi'im around. Aval bimei Mordechai Hayu Chagai Zechariah uMalachi. In the time of Mordechai, there were still some Nevi'im around, the last of the Nevi'im. The Nevi'im, Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi, who prophesied about the return to Eretz Yisrael at the very end of the first exile. And if we look at the Maharsha in number 12, sorry.
There's just one thing before you. How does it fit in that Hanukkah, the light of Hanukkah, is not from Bereshit, starting that like the world was created, but it's created from Aleph, and it's the Hanukkah light will always be even after. That's what's going to keep going.
Okay, I don't want to get into Hanukkah right now. We'll do that maybe at Hanukkah time. Although something later on the page will relate back to Hanukkah. It's a very interesting question, and my first thought, and this is only a thought from that I just arrived at on one leg now, is the Mishkan. This is relevant to last week, this week, etc. The Mishkan is a microcosm of the world or the universe, and in many ways you can see how the way the Mishkan is divided up into different sections that matches the way the universe is divided up into different sections. God created the world. We created, under God's instruction, the mini version of the world. That's called the Mishkan, and therefore I think it's quite appropriate that God, in His macro world, created light, and we, in the mini world, created light through our olives. And it's that light that will endure. But I'll leave that for another time. Okay, continuing the Maharsha, commenting on the Rashi in number 11. So Rashi in number 11, just to pick up the thread, said, at the time of Mordechai, there were still Nevi'im around. And therefore the comment of, it was the Nevi'im who introduced Mikra Megillah, but when acting as rabbis, the Maharsha says, for old Perish Rashi, aval bimei Mordechai, hayu Nevi'im, Chagai Zechariah Malachi, ad kan l'shano. Quotes the Maharsha, who says there were Nevi'im around in the time of Mordechai. But then the Maharsha says, Mordechai gufei hayanavi. Mordechai himself was a Navi. Kaperish Rashi, as Rashi explains, Miseda Olam, based on the Midrash called Seder Olam. V'chein Esther hayta nevi'ah. Esther was also a prophet. Bimei Mordechai. Ukadakaman nira delakach nekat hacha hanaviim v'haniviot. And that's why the Gemara that we saw in number 9 referred to not rabbis, but the Nevi'im of the Nevi'ot. The Mikra Megillah hotira al yedei Mordechai ve'Esther shahayahu navi v'hi nevi'ah. Because the Mikra Megillah was instituted by Nevi'im, by Mordechai and Esther. But here's the point, and this is why I quoted this Rashi. Mordechai straddled the two eras, the era of Nevuah to the era of Chazal. Mordechai is the pivot. Mordechai and Esther are the hinge on which this turns. So they started as Nevi'im, and they were Nevi'im, but they introduced the mitzvot of Purim, of which Mikra Megillah is representative, acting as Rabbanim, acting as Chazal, using the techniques of Chazal, which means we darshan, my darish, we darshan to work out what the halacha is. We don't ask Hashem what the halacha is. We have the famous story, which ends with the punchline, Lo b'shamayim hi, the Torah is not in heaven, it's for us to work out down here. But that's in the period of the rabbis. In the period of the Nevi'im, things were different. And Purim represents the moment when the Nevi'im gave way to the Rabbanon. And the fact that this book, uniquely, out of all the Nach, can contain mitzvot, because those mitzvot come from the rabbis, tells us that this is now a new era. There was a previous era, and this is now a new era. And in this new era, there won't be Nevi'im, there will only be rabbis. Now, at this point, I want to ask a question which is often asked when one analyzes this sort of subject. Why are there no Nevi'im after this time? Why does the HaKadosh Baruch Hu not send us Nevi'im? And let me offer a psychological answer. So the Nevi'im used to meet in the town square, in the market, and they would stand on a stone and they would give their message, and the people would say, wow, this is an important message. We must listen to what the Nevi'im are saying because they're speaking on behalf of God. If somebody in the Malcha Mall stood up and said, I've got a message from God, what would we do? We'd send him to hospital because we'd assume he's got some psychological problem. What would we not do? We wouldn't say, oh, let's hear what God has to tell us. In the times of Nevi'im, sometimes they did and sometimes they didn't. which is better than our record now.
Well, Mordechai already gave them advice that they didn't listen to, which is why the whole story
Yep,
started.
possibly. Yep. Why wouldn't we listen to Nevi'im now, and would we listen to Nevi'im then? And here comes my answer to where we started. And that is this. The people in the time of the Nevi'im had an awareness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which after the time of Nevi'im, we don't have. There was a sense of God in the world, which they merited to receive, and we, alas, don't have that. Why was there a sense of God in the world? It's not just our fault, because during the whole period of Bayit Rishon, from Yetziat Mitzrayim until the end of Bayit Rishon, there were open miracles. Starting with Yetziat Mitzrayim, 10 plagues, splitting of the sea, very, very obvious demonstration of Hashem's power, Hashem's existence, Hashem's care for Klal Yisrael. And when the Jewish people were told, do you want to accept the Torah or not? It is possible to explain that they didn't really have a choice. If HaKadosh Baruch Hu appears without any possible doubt that this is HaKadosh Baruch Hu acting in the world, and you're sitting in Egypt, and you see plague after plague after plague, and then you come out of Egypt, pushed out by the very Egyptians who enslaved you for hundreds of years, and you come to the sea, and you get worried what's going to happen to the sea, and the sea splits, and then you come to a mountain which bursts into flames, and Hashem says, here, I've got an idea. Do you want to accept the Torah? There was no rational way in which they could not do otherwise. It was absurd. Do you put your hand in a flame? No, you don't put your hand in a flame. Could you? Yeah, you could, but nobody's going to do that. Could the Jews have said, no thanks? Possibly. But would that have been in any way a rational decision? No. When Hashem's presence is so obvious, you don't have a choice. And that, I'll just say perhaps, is what the Gemara means when it says the mountain was held over their heads. The mountain was held over their heads because to symbolize the fact that they did not have a choice. It wasn't rational to say, no, we don't want the Torah. It's like saying, I'll walk through the fire. You won't do it. Just a moment. Continue my thesis. And the manifestation of God in the lives of the Jewish people, the obvious existence of God was continuing throughout the time period of Bayit Rishon in at least two ways. Number one, there were open miracles in the Bet Mikdash every day. Every day you could go to the Bet Mikdash and you could see the hand of Hashem. But furthermore, as we know, Sefer Shoftim in particular is all about the Jews do something bad, Hashem sends an enemy, the Jews do teshuvah, Hashem sends someone to redeem them, a shofet. In the period of Malachim, it's not quite so obvious, that cause and effect isn't quite so obvious, but it's pretty obvious. It's pretty obvious. Bad things happen to bad people, good things happen to good people. That was the world in which they lived. And for all that time, from Yetziat Mitzrayim right through to the end of Bayit Sheni, it remained an irrational choice to reject the Torah and to reject God. Bayit Rishon, thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, you confirmed you're listening. Thank you. Throughout the whole of Bayit Rishon, it remained the fact that Hashem's presence was so obvious, so manifest, that it wasn't an option to say, we don't want the Torah. And that's why there wasn't a need for a rectification of what we call in the Gemara, this Moda'ah Rabba D'Oraita, this big problem with the Torah, because that same problem, if you like, it continued to exist. The problem was there was no real way of refusing the Torah, not on a rational basis, and that continued to be the case. So I like to walk around. That continued to be the case in time of Bayit Rishon. What happened at the end of Bayit Rishon? That's when things changed. And what's the most obvious example of how Hashem is not apparent in the post-Purim world? In the Megillah, there's no mention of Hashem. Now we know that the way we read the Megillah is we look for all the hints that Hashem is there. We look for all the refuah before the makkah, as Chazal say, the cure before the punishment. We notice the fact that Esther was installed as queen before Haman came up with his plan. We noticed that Bigtan and Teresh had been unmasked before it was necessary to find favor for Mordechai. And example after example after example. We know that Haman built the gallows with the intention that Mordechai be hanged on it, but only because those gallows existed was the king able to say, hang Haman on it, etc., etc. So all these ways, we're not just looking for cute examples of refuah before the makkah. We're looking for the hand of Hashem, because the hand of Hashem is hidden. because it is possible to read the Megillah as saying a totally secular account of some political machinations going on at the Persian court. It's possible to read it without Hashem. It's possible to live our lives as if Hashem is not there. It's possible because we live in a world where Hashem is hidden. And our task is to seek for Hashem in this world where he is hidden. When does that start? That starts with Megillat Esther. That starts with Purim. Purim is the time when every other book of the Chumash every other book of the Tanakh has been about Hashem did this, Hashem sent this message, Hashem shared this message. The Megillah stands out as one where Hashem is hidden.
But Hashem has the refuel of Nehemiah when he writes in his Chumash,
Okay, so, but we still have to look for it. We still have to look for that connection. And that's what rabbis do. They look for connections. They look behind the text. And that's what we have to do. And that's why the Torah, the mountain over their heads was, if you like, a problem from Matan Torah through to the end of Beit Rishon. But Kimu v'Kiblu, they accepted the Torah again in the time of Purim. Why little old Purim is such a significant day in the Jewish history, the day of the reacceptance of the Torah? Because Purim created the environment of God being hidden. The offer of the Torah, when God was manifest, when God was revealed, that's the older phase. The new phase is when God presents himself in a hidden way and says, will you accept the Torah? And when the Jews accept the mitzvot that Mordechai gives them, they are showing that in a totally rational way, in a world where God is hidden, where they do really have a free choice, i.e. there's no mountain over their heads, they are able to accept the Torah. And that is the willing acceptance of the Torah. And that is why the problem of the Torah being forced upon them, because Hashem's presence was so obvious, has now been rectified, and it's rectified in Purim. So Purim represents the coming together of a lot of different factors, which I think there's a common theme. Obviously, Hashem's name is not there, because we're now in an era where Hashem is hidden. That's why, by the way, before Purim, if a Navi came and said, I'm a Navi, people would listen to him because they have an awareness of God in the world. After Purim, if a Navi came and said, I'm a Navi, people would say, no, you're not, because we don't have that sense of that connection to God. Purim is also the time when the Nevi'im, who bring direct messages from God, hand over to the rabbis who don't have direct messages. That's why they have to work it out for themselves, which is harder, although it gives more opportunities. And that's why the Torah is so great to learn, because there's so much to learn of it, because there's so much discussion about how we should understand what the Torah is actually saying. That's the period of Chazal, which begins with Mordechai and Esther, who bridge the gap. They are, as we saw in the Maharsha, both Nevi'im, and they are also, the Maharsha didn't say it, they're both rabbis. Don't ask me whether Esther can be a rabbi. We won't get into that one. This is the OU. Okay, yes.
I know we talked a lot about intellectual change, but it could be that under the mountain that it wasn't so intellectual, but rather a spiritual connection with a certain level where, with Hashem, that merging at that moment didn't allow it. Not that intellectually
Yeah.
it wasn't.
Okay, I'll probably take a more intellectual view because I'm probably more into the intellect and less into the spiritual. But I hear what you say. What I presented as an intellectual problem, that Hashem's presence is so obvious, can also be understood as Hashem's spirit infused the people in such a close connection. Okay, we've got a little bit more time, so I want to go a little bit further, because there's another little piece to this puzzle that I think fits very well. In number 13, the Gemara in Yuma describes a very strange event, based on a pasuk from Nehemiah, which says, "V'yizaku el Hashem Elokim b'kol gadol." They cried out. So, to give a little bit away of what's coming next, we're talking about the leaders of Jewish people, a little bit after the Chorban, of Beit Sheni, which of Chorban of Beit Rishon. And the Navi says, they cried out to Hashem in a big voice. And then the Gemara says, "My Amor," what did they cry out? What did they say? What were they asking for? Amar Rav, V'itema Rabbi Yochanan, Rav, or some say Rabbi Yochanan said, "Bai bai," which is translated usually sort of woe, woe. Hainu hai da'achrive le'mikdasha, v'kalei la'heichalo. There's this thing which has destroyed our Bet Mikdash, which has burnt our Heichal, our sanctuary, the Katlino Lekulhu Sadike, and has killed all of the Sadiqim, ve'iglina liYisrael me'arehan, and has exiled the Jewish people from their land. And furthermore, v'adai meraked beinam, and it's still dancing amongst us. They're referring to the Yetzer Hara. Here we have this very obscure episode where the leaders of the people, Chazal, at that time, complained to HaKadosh Baruch Hu about the Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara has caused us to do bad things, which has resulted in the Chorban Beit HaMikdash and the exile and the deaths. And we still have this Yetzer Hara dancing amongst us. And then they say, Klum havit yahavte lan ela kabule be igra. The reason you gave us the Yetzer Hara was that we could receive reward for not following the Yetzer Hara. If there is a tempter, only then can we get the benefit of not being tempted. But then they say, Igra lo ihu be'enan. We don't want that reward. We don't want it, and we don't below Igra be'enan, and we don't want the reward. Thank you very much, God. You've given us this Yetzer Hara, which if we reject it, we get a reward. But we know that if we don't reject it, we get destroyed. So we'd rather not have the Yetzer Hara at all. So the story carries on. Number 14. Utive betanite talte yame. So in accompanying their request to Hashem, they fasted for 3 days, the talte lelota, and 3 nights. Masruhu nehele, and Hashem handed it to them. He handed the Yetzer Hara. Amar lahei navi Yisrael, hainu yitzra d'avodah zarah. This was the Yetzer Hara for avodah zarah. So the Gemara is describing a time when the Yetzer Hara for avodah zarah was destroyed. Now, by the way, there's a bit more to the story. Initially, they asked for the Yetzer Hara for all transgressions to be destroyed. Then they noticed the hens weren't laying eggs, and they realized some desires are good and are necessary for society to function. So they sort of modified the request, and what they ended up with, they destroyed the Yetzer Hara for avodah zarah. That's what the Gemara says. And in a dramatic fashion, in a story which may or may not be taken literally, it answers the question, or gives an answer to the question, why don't we have a Yetzer Hara for avodah zarah anymore? We don't. If you read Tanakh, which we've talked about a lot today, you find the Jews were very, very often tempted into avodah zarah. They would sacrifice their children. They would do all sorts of repugnant things. They would presumably dance around totem poles, like we have this image of how idolatry works. Anyone want to fancy dancing around a totem pole today? Anyone want to do any of the repugnant things that are described in the Torah about avodah zarah? It wouldn't occur to us. We would never even think of it. Why don't we have this desire to do avodah zarah like we're told over and over again our ancestors did? So the Gemara says, because the Yetzer Hara for avodah zarah was destroyed. But there are 2 sides to this coin. And going back to our bigger theme of we now live in an era where Hashem is hidden. When people worship totem poles or trees or planets, they obviously did a terrible thing, which is utterly to be repudiated, but they did it because they had a sense of the divinity. If you worship a tree, you deify that tree. You say, this tree, it's some sort of God. At least you are aware of the idea of God. Now you ascribe it to the wrong places and the wrong things, but at least you have an idea of God. We live after the Yetzer Hara was destroyed, the Yetzer Hara for avodah zarah. And that means we don't have the desire to serve other gods. We don't have the desire to sacrifice our children or to dance around totem poles. That's very, very good. However, the flip side of the same coin is when Hashem acts in a hidden way, we don't see him. We don't look for him. We don't deify trees, good. But we don't deify God either, not good. And this is part of the Post-Purim era. This is part of the baggage that comes with it. Hashem moves into a hidden mode. Just like avodah zarah was conquered, the Yetzer Hara for avodah zarah was conquered, this matches up to roughly the period that we're talking about, because in number 15, the Seder Olam says, Alexandrunas Mokdam, Alexander the Great, Shemalach Yud Bet Shana, Ad Kan Hayu HaNeviim Mitnavim, Beruach HaKodesh, until the time of Alexander, the Nevi'im were prophesying with Ruach HaKodesh, Mikan ve'elech, but from Alexander's time onwards, Hat Oznecha Ushma Divrei Chachamim. Incline your ear and listen to the words of Chachamim. And in number 16, the Gra, the Vilna Gaon, It says, Perush, Mishahargo et Yetzahara Batla Hanavua. He says that bit in Seder Olam that says the Nevuah came to an end at the time of Alexander the Great, the Greeks coming into Eretz Israel. That was also the time for the story described in number 13 and 14 about the end of the Yetzirah for Avodah Zarah. It was the coming of the Greeks, which was 150 years after Purim. In other words, the blink of an eye. It was just after Purim, the Greeks came to Eretz Israel, says the Vilna Gaon, that we match up with the story of the destruction of the Yetzirah for Avodah Zarah. Because, and now, I don't have time, and now we'll come back to this maybe at Hanukkah time, because this is really a Hanukkah shir, but the Greeks had Hellenism, which was different from paganism. And in Hellenism, you don't worship wood and stone, you worship just a big version of yourself, and that's the epitome of what Hellenism is all about. So if we can now draw all these threads together, Mordechai and Esther are at the time of the waning of the period of the Nevi'im and the beginning of the period of Chachamim. According to the Vilna Gaon, based on the Seder Olam, that finally reached its finale 150 years later when the Greeks came, Alexander the Greek came, and they were told explicitly, there's no more Nevi'im. Since the Yetzirah for Avodah Zarah has gone, that's good, but we live in a world where we don't see God as much as we should. And we live in a world where God has hidden himself. His name is not in the Megillah. Extra mitzvot are in the Megillah because it's not written by a Navi. It's not a Nevuah from Hashem. But it's the beginning of the post-Purim era. On Purim, we dress up. And on Purim, part of the fun is finding who's behind the mask. Our task on Purim and every day of the post-Purim era is to look for Hashem behind the mask. It's hard. It was easier in the time of Nevi'im. But now when we live in the world where Hashem is hidden, our task on Purim, as we read the Megillah, but as we look at every event in life, and we have a lot of events at the moment, and a lot of times to opportunity to see the hand of Hashem, that is our task in the post-Purim era. I'll see you next week.